I'm Jennifer Lohefner. I'm the Associate Director here at I2S. And today I get the privilege of introducing our keynote speaker, Mr. Bruce Wang. Bruce is an engineering director at Netflix. So he's joining us virtually from the West Coast today. I'm also lucky enough to call Bruce a former colleague, and I can say with certainty he's one of the most brilliant engineers I've ever worked with, but arguably an even more brilliant leader, which I think you'll see. I think that'll be evident by what he's going to touch on today in his talk. So with that, please join me in welcoming Mr. Bruce Wang.
Hey, how's everyone doing? Sorry, it's a little hard to see everyone, but I see folks sitting in the desk. So thank you, Jennifer. You're too kind. She's lying. Whatever she said, she's just lying. Anyways, yeah, I'm Bruce. I live in San Francisco. I'm currently in Los Gatos, where Netflix is based. I'm in a room called Diego. Hargraves, which if you know what Umbrella Academy is, it's based on the name of character. So yeah, I've been in the industry about 23 years. Software developer about 15 of that, and a leader for 12. That doesn't add, that's on purpose, because I've also been a hands-on leader for a bit of time. Was a 2-time founder, 1 exit, 1 failure. How I know Jennifer is one of the companies I co-founded was acquired by Perceptive Software, and that's where we met and worked together. Also a seed investor, mentor, advisor. I have this thing where I'm getting older, and what would I do if I didn't have to work? And this is what I would do. I'd be a mentor. And then as Jennifer mentioned, I've been in Netflix about a little over 3 years. So cool. I think what I wanted to do is how I thought about this kind of how to, what makes an engineer great talk. I wanted to maybe step back and talk about my own career, and then kind of how I think about teams, and then maybe get into the more specifics. And so I kind of want to highlight sort of, an example of an engineer's journey, which is my own. So here you can kind of look. I started my career. I went to Michigan as a computer engineering degree. I got a bachelor's in computer engineering. I was an intern at 2 companies with local software. I don't even remember what that company was called anymore. So I just put local software company in Ann Arbor. And then Tel Labs is a bigger telecommunications company that I worked at my junior year. And then I graduated and went to Marimba, where I was a software engineer, Java software engineer. Marimba is about 200 people. What was really cool about Marimba is it was started by 4 of the founders and creators of Java itself. So it used to be called Project Oak in Sun, and 3 of the engineers and the product manager started Marimba. So it was pretty cool to work with some pretty brilliant software engineers. So I did about 4 years, but in college, I really enjoyed business, and I had actually thought about switching to business school. I was in the engineering school at Michigan. I was like, well, this is during the dot-com boom. Maybe most of you, I don't know, most of you may not have been born then. But anyways, it was a very, very interesting time to be an engineer. And so I was like, hey, I'm going to stay in this, and then I can always get my MBA later. So with that, I had always dreamed of starting my own company. And so with one of my team leads at Marimba, and then his college roommate, we started a company called Twistage. It's not called Twistage before. And it was just such a pivotal experience. It's where I learned so many different things, not just around business, but technology. DevOps was just starting. AWS was just starting. We had to just examples, we met someone who could get us in the private beta for AWS for EC2 and S3. Back then, that was the only 2 services that they had, is EC2 and S3. So EC2 is their compute system, and then S3 is their massive storage system. And so that kind of startup experience was just so amazing for me. And that was also when I kind of first had my hand at management. where I was like leading the team, but also building a lot of the software. And Eddie will tell you I was a terrible manager then. It was a very difficult experience for me because I never had training. And and you'll hear this in the industry where sometimes a leader sort of an engineer sort of accidentally becomes a manager, right? And same thing for me at Twistage. So Twistage was a OVP, online video platform. Little funny origin story. We were actually creating a P2P CDN based off of a BitTorrent. And to showcase the P2P CDN, we built a video sharing site. And we didn't realize video sharing was going to be humongous. What was interesting is we were attending a conference in New York, and that was when Vimeo launched, right? And we started doing research, and we're like, oh, there's a lot of people in this video sharing. And there's this little company called YouTube that's like crushing everyone, right? And so we got to see the rise of YouTube, the acquisition, and pretty much everyone had to pivot when YouTube won that market. And so we became a B2B video software company. So you would buy our software, and then we allow you to build video products on top of that. And so that was kind of one of the reasons why Lexmark or Perceptive Software acquired us for both our expertise in managing videos and video content, but also our cloud sort of native, software development model. And we were born in the cloud, used cloud software in the early days. We did continuous delivery and deployment before it was a thing. We did DevOps before it had a name. So we did a lot of techniques that is kind of commonplace today for most of the software companies. So, SaaS, we were SaaS before it was called SaaS, so really interesting time and great experience, a lot of learnings. It was a struggle as well. And then, when I took over, when we got acquired, I had an opportunity to lead a bigger team. And so this is where I kind of got more formal training in leadership. I ran a 60-person team at the end of it, and I had my own P&L, profit and loss, which means I managed all the revenue that coming in and all the costs. I would present to the CEO monthly. It was a fantastic experience, but I led managers. It was not in software, working with folks like Jennifer, who was in the software group, to run their, the software in the cloud. And, I really missed it. And so in 2016, 17, by the way, I actually moved from San Francisco to Kansas. So I lived in Overland Park area. My wife actually went to KU for a period of time before we moved back. And so I went to a startup that was based in Kansas City called Brightergy, which was a commercial solar company that had a vision towards more technical, more of a software-based service. And so I joined that in downtown KC. Then that was a great experience. And that allowed me to kind of get back in as a hands-on leader. It was funny because during this time, so when we created Twistage, it was on a technology called Ruby on Rails. Whatever you say about Ruby on Rails is great at starting stuff. But, as you scaled out, you run into various problems. And technology, Elixir came out during that time. Elixir Phoenix came out, which is alternative to Ruby on Rails. And so that was something that I got my hands on and built services in that area, and also led a team, so more of a hands-on leader. And then in 2017, came back to San Francisco, and then became CTO of a startup called Sync FM. It was based in Norway. I was like, hey, I want to go work for a startup based in Norway, so I can go visit Norway. And it was on video stuff, which I knew. And so I did that. And then after that, it was this was the failure. So I, started as the CTO, then became co-founder, did it for a year and a half, loved it, ran out of money, laid myself off, and then was looking for another job. And this was a really hard time for me just because, having done a startup and exited, having led massive team, not massive, but, to me, a pretty big team. And then like having to go find a job and struggling, it was kind of an eye opener for me, but it was a good experience. And eventually I ended up at a place called Packet where I was VPE. Packet is a bare metal cloud provider. And so think of like AWS, but instead of like slices of machines, you're actually getting physical boxes that you have access to. And that was when I really became more focused as a people leader. I wasn't as hands-on. I mean, they were on Ruby on Rails, so I had that experience. Did some small stuff, but was the first time other than at Lexmark, where it wasn't even in a software group, that was the first time where I kind of really focused on people leadership. And I managed ICs and managers. So, 3 teams, 15 engineers. And then it's funny because it's like, okay, Packet was a New York-based company and it was funded by a fairly well-known, fund, SoftBank, probably some of you may have heard of it. Then I was like, well, I want to work for an SF-based company, and so then Shippo was a, SF-based startup that had an office in SF and, was backed by some very well-known VCs. And I was like, okay, let me do that. And so Shippo was kind of wanted to be like Stripe for shipping. So APIs allow you to like ship stuff. So if you buy anything online, you got to actually ship it, right? And so Shippo is software that lets you create shipping labels and then mail out things. And so I happened to know the VP there, and she happened to have a role, and I left. If you kind of notice a little bit, I had spent 9 years building my startup and then 3 more years at Lexmark. So 12 years, so 4 and 12. And after that, it's been a lot of jumping around, right? I was at BrightEnergy for about a year, Sync for a little over a year, Pack for less than a year, and then Shippo for less than a year. And so at Shippo, I led ICs, so 3 teams, 10 engineers. And then I took over, and then it's funny, I did a presentation about APIs. And so that's something pretty much most of the companies I've dealt with, other than Marimba, has been API-based companies. And so I know a thing or two about it. So I did a presentation about APIs and microservices, and a recruiter from Netflix found me. And so something to know, like Netflix has a very unique culture. They posted a 100-page slide deck about their culture, and something that I had read in 2007, and I modeled a lot of my engineering culture based on that. And so and then, I had done 2 video companies. So Netflix for me was like sort of the dream company. But, something where it's like, I never worked for Fang. I didn't think I could get into Fang, but they, reached out, and I was like, okay. And I was like, okay, maybe I'll give it a try, didn't really have expectations of being able to land the job, but, it worked out. It's just happened to that at that time, Netflix is all about talent density, which just means super senior engineers, but very few of them, right? And they really needed a director who could set the vision of the API systems team, but also be able to manage engineers on hands-on. So instead of managing a bunch of managers or junior directors, just manage ICs, right? And be okay with that. And I think that helped me a lot with my API expertise, understanding the video space, and then also, pretty good with managing ICs, right? And obviously that's changed. Now I manage managers. I still managed a direct team as well. Not a huge team, right? About 20 plus engineers, but been fantastic experience. I was like, if I can make it at Netflix, I would love to stay for at least a few years, because before that I was kind of jumping around. And so, I've had the privilege and opportunity to be here for about over 3 years. So gives you a little highlight of my career. And so I wanted to kind of tell you, okay, so, I've done a decent amount of stuff, right? This is over 23 years. So what next for me personally, right? And so, I don't know, actually. right now I'm rethinking my team and my role and where can I provide the most impact for Netflix. And I'm working on some pretty exciting stuff. But I ask this all the time, like, what do I want to do? Should I switch to a different team at Netflix? Should I start another company? Do I want to be a VPE at a more established, even a bigger startup? Do I want to climb the corporate ladder, aim for VP at a FANG? Do I want to be CEO of a smaller company? Do I want to go back as an IC? Or do I want to go work for a VC and like be an advisor for a VC, right? Or, I don't know. And so just kind of tell you, like, for me personally, I've done a lot. And I'm kind of at that part of my career where I'm like, hey, what's next? And so that's a little bit about myself. And hopefully this will kind of set the context for, our conversation next. So cool. Before we get into like what makes a great engineer, and just to like burst your bubble, I'm not going to have a lot of slides on what makes an engineer great. So there's not going to be some epiphany that you're going to all of a sudden realize. But what I wanted to say is, like, what makes a great engineer is first the engineering culture they're in, right? Or the engineering culture they create. So I have a leadership philosophy. I have a GitHub page that has all this information. I think Jennifer has the slide deck, so if you all want to click on it later, that's cool. So I have this very simple engineering leadership philosophy: trusting teams, seeking excellence, driving customer delight. That's kind of what I anchor my teams on, how I think, and I'll break this down a little bit. So what does trusting teams mean? So trusting teams in my mind is about creating a learning zone. So if you see this, X and Y axis, you have psychological safety up on the Y, and then accountability on the X, right? And what's really interesting that maybe not a lot of people know is that if you haven't heard of the concept of psychological safety, it's this kind of like creating an environment where you feel open to talk about your mistakes, right? And a very common misunderstanding of psychological safety is that's like, well, like if you don't have, if you're like too nice, then, and you don't talk about stuff, you might have a safe environment, but not a great team. And it's like, no, that's like literally not the definition of psychological safety, which was actually discovered by a researcher called Amy Edmondson, was that they found the highest performing teams in a hospital were actually the teams that made the most mistakes. It was very confusing. It's like, wait, how could the team making the most mistake was the best team in the hospital? And it's because they were more open. So what was happening is the worst teams were not talking about the mistake. They were making the mistakes and they had worse medical outcomes. They just weren't talking openly about it. And so safety to me is really about being able to admit your mistakes and learn from it. And then having the high accountability, right? That's the other counter to this, is that, hey, what are we doing all this for? So we can execute. And so having high accountability is really important. And that's how you create the learning zone, right? You feel safe to talk about problems, you learn from the problems, and you iterate on that, right? And there's some really cool stuff we do here at Netflix like that. You have something called OOPS: make mistake, learn from it, and move on, right? And so this is super important for me. And there's a lot more concepts inside trusting teams, but like I wanted to kind of highlight the thing that I really believe in is like you have to create a trusting team first. Without a trusting team, it sort of doesn't matter. None of the other stuff matter. The second part is really borrowed from Netflix culture, seeking excellence. And there's a link there. And if you ever want to read it, it's like one of the best written culture memos you'll see. And having been inside of it, we have challenges and issues like everyone, but we really believe in it and we really talk about it. And so seeking excellence is the idea that we want to get better and we want to grow. And so we want to, for instance, encourage decision-making by employees, share information openly, be candid and direct with each other, keep only highly effective people. This is probably the scariest part of the Netflix culture, is we talk about keeping A players, C players, B players get a severance package. I was worried about that language as well. We're not that ruthless. It's just about, hey, we want to keep the best people. And don't you want to work with the best people? I'm sure you all have been in teams that did not have the best people. And unfortunately, you can't really fire your teammates, right? But this is something that's very important. You want to have a really strong team. And the last is avoid rules, which is really interesting. We have something called people over process. But this kind of notion of seeking excellence is you're trying to get better, you're trying to learn, you're trying to grow. And there's a lot of things involved in being excellent, right? You want to hold yourself to that high standard, to be like in that upper echelon of execution, right? And then lastly is driving customer delight. Like, for me, I'm in a commercial company. What are we doing this for if we're not driving customer delight, right? So this is just a thing about product market fit, whether you're in a startup or not, you're always trying to get product market fit, right? The concept, which is that you have an idea and it turns into something and you want to validate and you start scaling and you have the growth and it's really about driving customer joy. We call it member joy at Netflix. But for me, this is what my third anchor is on, is if we're not driving value for the business, it doesn't matter. So like, I'm not a technologist for technologist's sake. It's not like, hey, let's use Rust because it's the hottest thing out there. It's like, okay, well, how does it drive value, right? And does it allow us to do something better? And does it give joy to our customers? And whether you're a B2C like we are, where you're directly, talking to consumers, or a B2B where you're working with other businesses, you want to be driving that customer delight, right? So I just kind of I always tell people, like, technology is not for technology's sake, right? You want to be able to be driving value. And so that's something that I really think about. And so that's sort of my 3 parts: trusting teams, seeking excellence, driving customer delight, right? It's a kind of thing that I use as sort of the 3 anchor points of how I think about leading teams, and basically how I think what makes a great engineer, right? Teammates who have this mindset is sort of the people that I want on the team, right? All right. So I want to leave plenty of time for Q&A. So I just kind of want to talk about your career, right? And this is where your mileage may vary. So here's the thing. I tell this to everyone I mentor and advise. This is your career. This is your world. What makes a great engineer is going to be based on what you value and what you think about. So you can sit up here and, listen to me talk about, oh, look at all this experience I had. Like, it's my experience, right? And like you saw earlier, I don't even know what I want to do with my career, right? And so I wanted to really highlight that, like, a lot of this is going to be based on where you all want to do. And, I've looked at, it was pretty awesome just to see the agenda today for I2S, and half the stuff I'm like, I don't even know what this means. So it's pretty cool. And so I think, don't read an article about, some company doing this and be like, oh man, I want to do this. Or like, oh, being part of a thing is so awesome. Well, you know what? Like, it changed pretty dramatically, during the time I've been here. If you think about the tech industry, it's, Google had one of its biggest layoffs ever. They laid off more people than Netflix has, right? Meta at first changed its name to Meta, but then also laid off a lot of people. And so this is kind of one of those things like, hey, you might say, oh, I want to chase the thing. And it's like, you know what? A lot of people struggled with that recently. And so I think it really comes down to, like, for your career, you're going to have to go through that journey and you're going to have to figure out what it is that you would want and the thing that you, are good at. And I'm not going to tell you here to, like, go chase your dreams or anything. Just take the advice with a grain of salt. And that's how I approach everything. Any article I read, any book I read, I always think about, cool, but how would that work in the context of where I am right now? Right. All right. So you might say, okay, but what makes a great engineer, right? So I'll tell you, like, be curious, be humble, be a lifelong learner. Like, if you're going to take away anything, I think for me, just I look at myself, what probably set me apart from some of the other people is just, I'm always curious. Like, I love learning about stuff, even stuff I don't know, right? I was on this, like, blockchain, Bitcoin kick for a bit of time. So I like listened to like this 20 segment, podcast from the Web3 Foundation around how blockchain works and stuff like that. It's like, yeah, I don't know everything that they're talking about, but it was just so fascinating, the economics and the technology involved to make something like that happen. And so it was just being curious about something. And just wanting that, I think this goes back to what makes truly great engineers, the ones who are curious and they want to learn. And they don't necessarily think too highly of themselves and want to grow and get better, right? And so you might be like, okay, but seriously, what skills do I need to be a great engineer? It's like, all right, I get it. You probably want to hear some very specific things. Well, here's the listicle, right? Communications. You probably heard communications everywhere. You got to be a strong communicator. Well, what does that actually mean? Well, to me, it means succinct at written and verbal communication. Really good at active listening. So here's the thing about communication, not just about you talking. It's about you actually listening to the other person. Giving and receiving feedback, that's part of communication as well. Giving harsh feedback is hard. Receiving harsh feedback is hard. And so the skills you need is communication skills. These are the type of skills you would need to be a great engineer, right? And so I wanted to kind of debunk this concept of like, oh, I just need to be good at public speaking. It's like, no, actually you don't. I've met many great engineers who are not good at public speaking and they don't want to be, but they're really good at listening. They're good at giving feedback. They're good at receiving feedback. That's what matters, right? The other is ownership mentality. Like, why are we doing this? What's the purpose? Leading a project from start to finish. I've been given feedback in the past where I'm really good at starting stuff, but I don't finish. And so how do I really take that ownership mentality, end to end? Be a polyglot, learn multiple languages, or disciplines. I know, so for some of you, you're kind of in ML and AI and, probably using Python or Scala or something like that. But hey, go learn Java, go learn about Rust. Why is Rust so hot, right? Like figure that out, or be in different disciplines. I love, two of my other subjects, I love organizational psychology and business, right? So if you look at the books I read, it's all in this realm, right? So go learn more stuff than just where you're at, right? Prioritization is probably the most important skills you can have. Probably know that as a student. How do you prioritize your time? How do you make trade-offs, right? And that's a really hard thing to do. And even seasoned leaders struggle with this, right? And I struggle with this. And Jennifer may not know this, but I was notoriously bad at time management. She probably does this. It's always late. I didn't show up on time. It was like really struggle for me. And it's something that, you got to get good at if you want to be great. Partnering, absolutely important. You could be the most brilliant single engineer. Won't matter if you don't know how to collaborate with people and partners and stakeholders. This is so important. It's like, how do you actually partner and figure out how to build something together, right? That's a big deal. The next three are really around technology stuff. So technology lifecycle. How does it work from idea to deletion? Going from 0 to 1. It's not enough to launch the service and get it running. I run a team that has 15-year history here, right? Netflix, maybe you don't know, is 25 years old, right? And we have a lot of code that's old, right? So how do you get rid of code that is in the ecosystem for 12 years and can't get off, right? So understanding that could be really helpful to be a great engineer. And depending on your expertise, understanding that life cycle is so important, right? If you're a software or plan to be in software, understand software lifecycle. Coding, testing, CI/CD, DevOps, all that stuff, metrics. Coding is the easiest part of engineering. It's the testing, it's the delivery, it's the operations, it's running it, it's keeping it running. That's the hard part. Anyone can write code, but like, how do you actually run it? And then the next one's understanding scale. And scale is in multiple dimensions, right? You have time dimensions. How do you think about technology that over many, many years, right? You have data dimension, like complexity and scale of the data structures, right? And so, for instance, my team has built out a federated GraphQL architecture at Netflix, and for our studio business, it's one of the most complicated graphs in the world, right? Because you're talking about like hundreds of engineers across dozens and dozens of applications, and representing the entire studio workflow from pitch to play is pretty complicated, right? People, when you have 2 people versus 10,000 people, right? How do you think about interaction points, right? Like, I mentioned I run a 20-person team, but I also, help lead a cross-functional org that has 40 teams in it, right? How do you do that? It's hard. I'll tell you that. It's very hard. And then the typical, you'll hear requests per second, millions of requests per second. And yes, my team has a lot of that. And that was an eye opener for me. I never worked at a company with this level of scale, right? And yeah, when you manage millions of RPS, it's a whole different beast than when you do 10. And so RPS is requests per second. The other thing is adapting. So change is constant. As I mentioned earlier, Netflix has changed a lot since I've been here, and having to deal with that. I failed at Netflix as well, and how to deal with that. Unforeseen circumstances. I joined Netflix in Jan 2020. You could figure out the math. It changed pretty dramatically in March when we had our lockdown. And so being able to adapt, and I'm going to put it again, having that growth mindset and be a lifelong learner is so important to be a great engineer. It's so I feel like the key to all of this is I was not a good communicator, and I figured out how to get better, right? I was not good at prioritization, and I figured out how to get better. And some of these things I didn't know until I joined Netflix, like understanding a technology life cycle of this sophistication and complexity, or partnership complexity. I didn't get that until here. And so having that growth mindset and learning from it and growing is kind of like the thing that has set me apart. And so I just wanted to kind of reiterate that that's such an important skill. All right. So yeah, I thought 30 minutes. See, this time management is over by 5, but that's actually it.